So I want to really thank the audience for hanging in until the afternoon on a Saturday. I'm so excited to see so many of you have stuck it out, and it even looks like some new people have joined, which is awesome. The word is spreading. So this afternoon's panel is motivated again by an interest in understanding, actually a question that came from the audience earlier, which is sort of how should we engage with these voluntary carbon markets if we represent institutions? How should institutions think about this? How does that vary from institution to institution? And we have a really amazing panel here to help us think through these issues, some of which we've talked about earlier and we'll come back to, and some of which are new. So I'm going to start off just by asking each panelist to introduce themselves quickly. I was going to introduce them, but they'll do a better job. So let's start with you, Tracey, and we'll move down the line.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's really awesome to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. My name's Tracey Osborne. I'm a faculty member at the University of California, Merced. I'm in the Department of Management of Complex Systems. I also lead the UC Center for Climate Justice. I'm also a visiting researcher at Google, and I also support the ICVCM, providing support for benefit sharing and safeguards. So my area of research is climate change mitigation in tropical forests. I've been looking at this question for many years. Much of my work has been in Mexico, in southern Mexico, and in the Amazon, and I do a lot of work with local communities and indigenous peoples. So while I've been a long-term researcher of these questions, in the last few years, I had the opportunity to develop a carbon offset project. Initially, it was designed as a carbon offset project with indigenous peoples of the Ecuadorian Amazon. And so it was an incredible learning experience to be in the position of a carbon developer. And so from that experience, learned a lot. I definitely, I think one of the things I want to share even more. I'll say more about that project, but I think one of the key lessons is the importance of local community and indigenous peoples, their leadership, given their important role as kind of managing the world's carbon, but also biodiversity. So I'll leave it at that and say more later. Yeah, pass it on.
Okay, David, your turn.
Great, thank you, and thanks Ricardo and the team for organizing this. Has been really impressive. Great to see a lot of people still in the audience, even on Saturday afternoon. So this is great. My name is David Antonioli. I'm a recovering standard setter. And I say that because I ran VERRA for almost 15 years, and I left the organization last June, to basically enable new blood to take over the organization, but had a really wonderful time seeing that organization, VERRA, grow from literally 2 people to 140 by the time I left. And we really kind of were with the market as it grew from a very small speck in the eye of a few people to being something that actually could be seen as driving significant climate change action. And before that, I worked at EcoSecurities, where I ran a joint venture doing landfill gas projects around the world under the Clean Development Mechanism. So, my professional career in the last 20 years has really been around carbon markets, and the last 15 at VERRA on, how do we develop rules and requirements that are practical and deliver the integrity you need in order to drive the change that we all desperately are pining for. So, yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, and Jen?
Can you hear me? Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Jen Jenkins. I'm the Chief Science Officer for Rubicon Carbon. Just a little bit about Rubicon. We were founded in 2022 by TPG, which is a private equity firm. TPG, I think, saw the sort of potential in the carbon market coming out of the 21 and 22 years, and sort of was interested in making a very big play in the markets, which they did. Overall, with Rubicon, our goal is to scale the VCM, and to do that by essentially applying the tools of finance to build the voluntary carbon market and to make it, turn it into the grown-up market that we all believe and know that it needs to be in order to have the kind of impact that will be required. And so we do three things especially well. We invest in projects that will, and developers and projects that will yield high-quality credits at the back end. We also sell what we call Rubicon carbon tons, which is sort of a portfolio-backed ton of carbon, which we can risk adjust, and I can talk more about that, later on. And we also allow our customers to hold those credits to sort of build their own portfolios using the credits that we have on our balance sheet. A couple things set us apart from our competitors and others in the space. One is that we actually hold the credits on our balance sheet. A typical broker might not do that, right? So we actually share the risk with our customers. And the other thing is just we have a really rigorous science-based diligence and sort of risk management, active management process that we undertake with our inventory. For myself, I was, I'm a recovering academic, I guess. So I spent, I sort of did, my technical background is in forest atmosphere carbon exchange. I spent a lot of years in and around government, in and around academia, ultimately found myself in the private sector because I'm impatient, right? And really just sort of find that the private sector is where the action is, and it's where people are really investing and putting their money where their mouth is, really, and making a big difference. So that's me. Thanks a lot.
So I want to kick us off with maybe an opportunity for you to weigh in, for each of you to weigh in on any question or issue that you think came up this morning that we should return to here. So I'm going to ask that sort of broadly, and I guess I'd like to frame it as, of the questions that have come up during the day, where do you see the biggest challenge for us to get, we're replete with challenges, and we heard a lot about them this morning, but if you were a student looking to really make a difference and move the needle on the most important challenge to carbon markets, or to carbon markets actually achieving the carbon reductions that we want them to do, where do you see that happening? And we'll just go down the line again. So Tracey, I'd love to hear from you.
So I think in the last couple of panels, we've heard a lot about integrity. I think that is, of course, like an important challenge, like making sure that in terms of the accounting is done properly, that we manage for leakage, for permanence, also the additionality. So I think that, and there's a number of organizations who are already here present who are doing some really great work in that area. I think one of the areas that has not been, while we did talk about co-benefits, I think that one of the areas that is also really critical for the success of the carbon market is to it's not just about doing no harm or less harm, and I think it's even beyond the co-benefits. I think it's developing and designing projects and programs and initiatives alongside local and indigenous peoples. The lands that are managed by local communities and indigenous peoples, it's something like 300 gigatons of carbon. These are also highly biodiverse places, and I do think that if we also get the social dimensions right, it also is very supportive of the issues like leakage and permanence. Communities will continue to manage those forests. It's often in their best interest to do so, if that's the case. And I think the other really important issue is around the cost of carbon. There's been this long-term assumption for natural climate solutions that they're the low-hanging fruit. And we've treated them that way. And I think because we're looking to forests and to other ecosystems as a low-hanging fruit, in a lot of ways, and we're also paying, the price has certainly come up in the last few years, but it's still nowhere near where it needs to be to compensate with the real commodity drivers of deforestation. Where I work, in the Amazon, it's large-scale logging, it's like large-scale agricultural production, it's palm oil, cattle, and even oil production. And there is, and even where I've worked in Mexico, in southern Mexico, cattle is a large driver of deforestation. And while local communities who are producing, food production, subsistence food production in their milpas. Those are the land uses that are targeted as the drivers of deforestation, whereas the large-scale cattle continue. So I think really recognizing that actually to do carbon offset projects well, to do any type of project well in tropical forests, like we've got to rethink this kind of the low-hanging fruit. We've got to pay prices that are significantly higher, that are at least equal to the opportunity costs of land, and have indigenous peoples be in leadership roles.
I actually want to follow up with you on that before we go to David, because somebody mentioned earlier an econometric analysis and said, well, I can't remember, was it you, Spencer? I don't remember who said it, but for $30 a ton, you could protect a huge amount of forest. And are you saying, Tracey, that basically it seems like that, but actually if you compare it to what you could make by soybeans or cows, $30 a ton wouldn't be close to enough? Or I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to do the economic. You have to run the numbers. You'd have to figure out exactly what would be the equivalent carbon price in order to at least equal what soybeans would produce in a hectare. And because ultimately in places where I work, I mean, it depends obviously in what forest, what ecosystems you're working in, but where I work, the real drivers are the commodity drivers, and those are not being impacted in any significant way through with the current carbon price.
Got it. David, what's your biggest challenge for us?
Wow. So I neglected to say this in my introduction, but since leaving VERRA, I've spent time thinking about what it is that we're trying to achieve and what we might be missing in the markets as they are designed today. And I think there's a few things, and I want to put this out there as potentially provocative thinking, but really to get us to where I think we could go with carbon markets. And there's a few things that I wanted to reflect on. But first of all, let me say that you mentioned the previous panels. You guys in the room, you were really lucky to see the panels before us. They were really high quality discussions from some of the top people in the market. So again, kudos to the organizers for pulling that group together. Really, really impressive conversation. But there's a few things that I think we are still missing. And the most important thing is that we have not answered the question about what happens when the party ends. And what I mean by that is what happens when carbon finance ends. If we think about what net zero looks like, let's say we all get to net zero in 2050, there'll be plenty of money for removals, and that's fine. But for all the avoided emissions that we're financing today, forest conservation, for example, there's going to be no money for that. So we have to plan for a day when we've got no more carbon, because we can't just rely on this resource forever. And I don't believe that we've designed the system in a way that does that. And if you think about the tools we're using, they're kind of antiquated. So I see a lot of great discussion, the MRV, the digitalization, that's all great. That's making the cost and the accounting and the rigor around the actual counting of the tons come down, and that's great. But the one word I keep hearing over and over is additionality. And if you think about it, we're still using a tool that was built 30 years ago to assess additionality. And I actually think we need to rethink and reconsider how we think about additionality, because if we use this tool, and it goes on to your point, Tracey, the reason it's so complicated to get a project through is that generally speaking, you have to prepare the equivalent of a 150 to 200 page PhD type document with all sorts of fancy justifications that then has to be defended 3 times now. You have to defend it before the auditing entity. You have to defend it before the crediting agency, the VERRAs, the gold standards of the world. And now you have to defend it before Spencer and the ratings agencies. That is a very expensive process. And if we're going to build a market that's going to help transform the world, we're not going to do it on the back of this system that we've built. So we need to streamline that process. And I think that back to the question of what we're trying to achieve, to me, it isn't necessarily about achieving a ton that we can be confident about. I think it should be that, but it should be more. It should be about how do we enable enough finance to be driven to sectors of the economy that actually gets that particular sector to flip and be on a sustainable pathway going forward. And then we pay for the chunk of stuff that we paid for, but then the entire sector comes around. But we have not designed the system to enable that. And I think that, to me, is the fundamental challenge that we face. If we can actually design the tools, and I go back to the additionality tool, if we think about additionality as a way to enable activity so that you actually get to that positive tipping point, I think we can get a lot more benefit and a lot more impact from the carbon market. And that's to me, that's where I think an area where we should be spending more time and thinking about, so that we can streamline the system, enable finance to flow at scale, and generate not only the impact on the carbon projects that we're doing, but on the sectors we're trying to achieve. Because again, we've not spent any time designing the system in a way that where we think about what happens to the sector where the capital is being deployed to. The tool, the additionality tool, let me make my last point. The additionality tool is meant to find a ton, and it's meant to support the polluter in helping to find the ton to meet their target. That's fine, but I think this next iteration of carbon markets, when we're trying to figure out how would they actually use them to transform and get us to the climate, the limitations on greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere that we need to be thinking about carbon in a different way.
Thank you. I agree, and we'll come back to that, but I have a different way of a different way. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Jen, what's your biggest challenge?
I agree. I think that scale is, for us, right, scale is the biggest challenge because we're not having the impact we know we can have, right? We're not leveraging this market to its full potential. But I have a different diagnosis for why, right? There's just a lack of demand, right? But let's talk about why there's that lack of demand, right? And I think there are a few things, right? In a nutshell, right? To understand that, right, you got to put yourself in the shoes of a board member or a CEO, right, sitting in the boardroom. They've made a commitment, and they want desperately to meet that commitment, right? But maybe they're having the same problem Brown had, where they got part way, and they're like, wait a minute, it's going to be our permits are delayed, or it's going to cost $350 per ton for the next marginal action that I can possibly take, and that's just way too much. And an offset over here is going to cost $20, so maybe I do that. But I can't guarantee that a project I purchased today isn't going to end up in the news tomorrow and drag me into the headlines with it. And that is terrifying for me and my board. So I'm just going to do nothing, right? And I'm going to kind of wait. Maybe I'll wait until 2029, right before my net zero target, so that, maybe this market will shake itself out. Okay, so that's, a lot of buyers are on the sidelines right now. We hear that every day. They know the market is inevitable. They know that eventually they're going to need offsets, but they're not ready to leap in today because of this PR risk that they sense. And it's real, right? It's 100% real. Okay, so why is that PR risk here? We are in a transition moment between what I would call VCM 1.0 and VCM 2.0. So VCM 2.0 is the one that Rachel is building, the one that Annette is working on, right, with the ICVCM and the VCMI and all of the standards, and the one that VERRA is working on now with its updated methodologies, and the one that Art Trees is working on with its jurisdictional RED+, right? Those are all sort of VCM 2.0. In the meantime, out there in the market, outstanding, not yet retired, are a whole bunch of VCM 1.0 credits, right? And so, those are the ones the media is focused on. Those are the ones that the sort of negative folks, the sort of offset the market, opponents, I guess, are sort of worried about. Well, with good reason, right? Because in some cases, maybe they didn't quite have the ton of impact, right, that maybe they should have. So we need to sort of, there needs to be education, right? Or we're not quite caught up, right? The media is still in a VCM 1.0 world. I think some of the quasi-regulatory bodies are still in a VCM 1.0 world. Thank goodness for the ICVCMs and the VCMIs of the world, because they are moving us forward. But it's going to take a little while, right? Do we have time? I'm concerned about that, right? So that's my piece.
Yeah, I think this is a great lead-in, and I mentioned in my opening remarks a little bit about Brown's journey, but it actually might be useful for the audience to understand a little bit about how we came to our decision to buy offsets. So in a little bit more granularity in terms of the barriers. So as I said, we set our carbon goals of net zero by 2040 and a 75% reduction by 2025, and come around, and at that time, I was insistent, and we all agreed, and the corporation agreed, no offsets. This is about fossil fuel elimination from campus. We're only dealing with Scope 1 and Scope 2, so we can have a separate conversation about Scope 3 later. But so no offsets. So then come 2022, and we're not going to make our 75% reduction by 2025 target. We have this wedge of 25% that we couldn't get rid of, right? And so then the question becomes, what offsets? So I argue no forest offsets, no agriculture offsets, because we can't guarantee additionality, we can't guarantee permanence, there's all this reputational risk, and as someone who studies the carbon cycle, I was actually most worried that the carbon wasn't actually going to come out of the atmosphere or stay out of the atmosphere. So we decided we were going to only focus on things that destroyed chlorofluorocarbons, or maybe things that captured methane, depending on the project. We had to hire a consultant to go out and lead a request for proposals from anybody who wanted to submit, collect all those proposals for offset projects, vet them. Then we brought finalists to campus to interview them. And then I grilled them on the biogeochemistry of whether or not they were actually measuring methane leakage at their anaerobic digester in an appropriate way. That took like a year, right? And required a huge amount of staff time and a lot of money. And we ended up with a project where we purchased offsets, and actually I've since found out that many other of our peers are purchasing offsets from the same company, that goes around finding abandoned canisters of chlorofluorocarbons, which would eventually leak to the atmosphere and have an incredibly high global warming potential. And they destroy them in an approved facility that therefore they're gone forever. And because their production is banned, that is it. And not only that, we gave them only a third of the money up front, and we said, we want you to go develop new projects with the money that we're giving you so that we can absolutely be sure it's additional, right? So good for us, right? Woohoo. There's no way to scale that, right? If there had been a rating agency that had told me, this is AAA, man, and it's definitely gonna take the carbon out, that would have been wonderful. And not only that, but even with that project, I read in the paper that there's a company in India that is producing CFCs illegally to sell, to destroy on the offset market, right? So like, even when you do all of your due diligence and you work super hard, right, it's problematic, right? And so I guess this leads me to my question, and I'm going to start with David, but please jump in. Brown is going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to decarbonize and eliminate fossil fuels. We could buy offsets for a lot less. I'd love for you to talk about when we as institutions should be going the offset route versus not. Can you just help us, and can you help us think that through? Like, I started with no way offsets. I'm right now at offsets because we have to for a limited time, but really I don't like them. I'm hearing a lot of discussion about how, if you can get, from an economic perspective, you can get the same ton out of the atmosphere for cheaper, that's better because you can do more tons. So I'm going to start with David, but again, anyone jump in. Like, under what circumstances should we buy offsets rather than spend that money on emissions reductions?
So it's a great question, but to me, it's about having a target, which you guys did, and you kind of came around reluctantly to the conclusion, like, oh, we can't meet that target. But that's a good thing, right? You guys set a very ambitious target, and you were very public about it and deliberate about it. And you found that you couldn't do that by, because you can't, you mentioned this, I think over breakfast, we can't just close down the university for 3 years and basically rebuild everything, right? You are an operating institution, you've that's kind of what you do. You can't operations for 3 years, so you have to do it over time. I think of someone who, think of a company who has a 10-year-old boiler, right? Bought new boiler 10 years ago, and that boiler has probably a 20, 25-year time frame on it. And so the question that you're asking the CFO to do is like, okay, let's retire that boiler today and leave 10 or 15 more years of operation on the table, take that hit financially, and then buy the new boiler that's going to cost us a lot more. That's a hard decision for a CFO to make, right? And understandably so. So I think in that case, you might be able to talk to the CFO and say, look, what if we retire this 5 years earlier than we would have otherwise done that? Like, let's say it was a 20-year time frame for the boiler. Can we retire it at 15 years, leave 5 years off the table, and we can buy offsets for the next 5 years? That, to me, is a very powerful tool because it allows you to bring in some environmental benefits because you're going to retire it earlier. And I don't know if you guys are going to do that here at Brown or not, but be that as it may, ultimately what the offset does is that enables you to have a smoother transition because you're not going to get a CFO to sign off on retiring that boiler today. No matter what kind of, in a perfect world maybe where we had all the resources we wanted, that might work, but that's not the world we operate in. So there are financial constraints to this decarbonization pathway, and it's costly and it's difficult. So to me, that is a great example, very simplified, but I imagine it might have been something similar along the lines of what you guys are struggling with, because you can't shut down the campus or you can't retire the boiler that you just invested in 10 years ago. So you've got to have a pathway, and that's where carbon offsets allow you to have a more practical discussion around how you're going to decarbonize, because you just can't flip it at a switch level.
If I could I
Yeah,
add
please, I was
to
coming to you next.
another way to answer that question? I think another example, right, is where there are certain sectors where decarbonization technology simply isn't available yet at a cost that is reasonable for a company, right? A lot of the decarbonization levers today are actually value destroying for a company because they're so expensive. And I have a personal, an example in my own work. I worked for a company that makes wood pellets, and they had, as part of their manufacturing process, they had what's called a regenerative thermal oxidizer, an RTO. And these RTOs, as they sound, they destroy air pollution so that you're not emitting sort of VOCs into the atmosphere as a result of the processing of the wood. So they run on gas, right? They run on natural gas. It's a thermal process, okay? You're not going to be able to create the kind of heat you need in that process using electricity. So, imagine, right, it's a 2-year-old facility, right? And now you're in this process of trying to build your net zero goal. The only Scope 1 emissions we had were from these RTOs. And so we were, faced with the decision, like, how do we manage? We can't just retire this big multi-million-dollar piece of equipment. One, its useful life has just begun. And two, our air permits are dependent on using this technology. We're going to have to shut the entire facility down if we try to sort of swap them out. Three, the technology to destroy these air pollution, constituents does not exist except in this thermal sort of process, right? So we simply we would have to go into an experimental phase to try to figure out another chemical way to destroy the VOCs if we wanted to have a sort of a non-emissive way to do that, right? And it's simply not possible, right? And so in that case, just to end the story, we didn't actually buy offsets. In that particular case, we ended up purchasing renewable natural gas instead of regular sort of, traditional natural gas to run as many of those facilities as we could cost effectively. But it was also in a rural environment, so you're not always on the pipeline, So, it wasn't kind of that easy. But I think that's not the only, just one example, right? But there are so many sectors. There's the chemical sector, steel, cement, right? These are huge portions of our economy, very emissive, and the technology to decarbonize them in a reasonable and cost-effective way simply does not exist. And that's, I think offsets can sort of buy you time while you watch and learn and experiment about how do you bring down the cost of these technologies so they can be adopted in a widespread way.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was about to ask you how that varies by sector and institution, but you just answered, so perfect. Tracey, I'd love to ask you to weigh in, and I think from two perspectives, if I can ask you to wear two hats. So you've already talked about your work, sort of on the ground in offset projects, and I'd love for you to say more about the project that you just developed, if you're able. But I'd also love to hear how the UC system, if you're comfortable talking about it, is thinking about offsets versus emissions reductions, because you're in California where things are much more regulated. Also, you're much bigger. So if you could weigh in on sort of institutional choices around offsets, and then also maybe tell us a little bit about the project.
Yeah, sure. So the UC, University of California, 10 campuses, in 2013 had a goal to be carbon neutral by 2025. And it was one of the first universities to take on, at the time, an ambitious goal. Over the next few years, the UC also recognized, a lot of what we've been talking about. There are a lot of problems with carbon offsets. There's the integrity issues, particularly around forests, and so offered, researchers and faculty seed funding in order to develop UC-initiated projects. I'll say more about the project in Ecuador, which was funded through, received seed funding from the UC. Last year, in 2023, in the summer of 2023, the UC decided to move away from the goal of carbon neutrality, given a lot of the issues we've been talking about, and to take on a more ambitious goal of decarbonizing the institution. And so it's an incredibly expensive process, as you can imagine. It's like something like $6 to $10 billion. But the idea is to decarbonize by 2045, and that's aligned with the state's goals as well. And they're also moving away from offsets altogether. So, as part of this process, there will be no offsets. It's obviously a much longer process to get to decarbonization, but that was the decision that was made because of all of the issues we've been talking about. So, in terms of, and I've seen this in, the UC is one of the largest public institutions. We receive support from the state as well. Not all institutions are going to be able to decarbonize their entire all campuses or the institution. It's just not economically possible. So while certainly we've got to applaud the UC for taking this action, it's not necessarily a model for other institutions. So I'll say a little bit about the project in Ecuador because, again, it was seed funded from the UC with the potential that project could support the UC in meeting its carbon neutrality goals. So I have as I mentioned, I've been working on carbon offset projects, carbon markets in tropical forests for some time, particularly with local communities. I'd had a longer term relationship with this Ecuadorian community in the Ecuadorian Amazon, a large area. They had a very clear sort of worldview about their sort of relationship with the forest, very sort of sacred relationship with the forest that was very coherent in how they manage the forest, sort of their cultural relationship, their the way in which they kind of the ecology and the way that which they manage the biodiversity. And so based on this sort of worldview, we began early conversations with them. We worked with them in the very early stages to develop the PDD, the project design document. They were part of like every decision-making process, a part of the process. They were deeply involved. We ended up working with an NGO, another large environmental organization, to support the MRV process, so the monitoring. We're monitoring for forests, for carbon, also for biodiversity. There also has a really strong social dimension. So the revenue from the project will support their life plans. So it's communally determined plans for well-being. And these are things like solar energy across the communities. These are also things like educational systems or educational centers that are both based in their own indigenous language as well as in Spanish. It's like health centers that are both, that include sort of more Western forms of medicine as well as indigenous knowledge. And I think also the idea was that we wanted to support them, to provide them the capacity and the capacity building to better monitor their forests against external threats. There are a number of oil leases on those lands. There are oil blocks on those lands. And so while as part of the project, we use a traditional and established certifier, and we go through all of the steps that are required for the project to be certified as a carbon offset. However, because the Ecuadorian state does not allow for the buying and selling of environmental services, we've actually pivoted. And also because of some of the deep concerns around offsets, we've actually pivoted toward what's called a carbon contribution model. And so a carbon contribution is also recognized under the Paris Agreement, under Article 6, but the buyer cannot actually claim carbon neutrality. So you can claim that you are contributing more broadly to climate change mitigation, but you can't actually claim it as a carbon offset toward your carbon neutrality goals. So, I think one of the major lessons here is that, first of all, this allowed for an indigenous group that had been fighting to keep their land intact. We now have given them the technology and the capacity to better monitor their forests from any external threat. It allows them to better keep that oil underground, and although we have not measured that will not be part of any sale, we also know that there's like over 30 million tons of carbon from keeping that remain underground because that land is even better protected. And I think that I also want to say that this project goes above and beyond FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. It's not like that communities have just given their consent to this project. They were deeply involved in the design and the development of the project. And I think that it means that it's going to be better, the sort of the permanence of this, of the benefits are going to be into the long term. It will be held into the long term. But I think also I want to say that, going back to your point about additionality, we have an expanded view of additionality. Indigenous peoples are often left out of carbon projects, out of carbon finance because of their land use practices and their management seen as non-additional. But if you take a more historical view, you can see the important role of local communities and indigenous peoples holding the line against the movement of the deforestation frontier.
Yeah, certainly you can, where I work in Mato Grosso, for example, you can see the Xingu Reserve sticking out into the soybean fields, right, very, very clearly from satellites. It's the only forest left. So your point is well taken. I guess I hadn't planned to really go exactly here, but I think, Tracey, your point really raises a thing I struggle with a lot in the broader concept of this conversation, which is the issue of time and the issue of accumulating carbon in the atmosphere, and the sort of what I'll describe as the perfect project, perhaps, versus the need for a lot of projects. And I'd love for you all to weigh in on, but maybe I'll start with you, David, in terms of verifying that this is doing whatever it's claiming to do. It seems like verifying a whole lot of projects, such as the one that Tracey just described, is almost, to me, it sounds like inconceivable to do in any sort of time frame that gets gigatons out of the atmosphere. Like VERRA's already strapped. And so I'm just curious how everybody thinks about this trade-off between getting a lot of money flowing and having a lot of projects that aren't nearly as holistically designed as the one that you just described, Tracey, versus the alternative. So we'll start with you, David, and then anyone else who wants to weigh in.
Thank you. That is exactly part of the challenge. I think you nailed it on the head. And so what I think we need to do is, yes, get a lot more finance to play in this sector. And what I think we need to do is we need to streamline the approval process. Like as I mentioned, we already have, the development of models that are doing digitalized MRV, right? And that's great because that's helping to streamline.
I'm sorry, can I just interrupt? Can you just define MRV? We've used those initials a lot of times, but just in case.
So MRV is monitoring, reporting, and verification. It's the process you go through to actually measure and report and verify the carbon that you've been able to either remove from the atmosphere or prevent from going to the atmosphere.
Thanks.
Thank you. And so what I think the big bottleneck to me is the entry point. Like, how do you accept projects into the system? And that's where I think we've got a real problem with the system that requires you to prepare, again, a 200-page PhD-type document that has to be defended multiple times. And I think what I find encouraging is that we have models that actually do this in a very different way. And they're called standardized approaches. And this was done initially with some great innovations by the Climate Action Reserve in California that was then taken up by the government of California. And if you look at the methodologies, we talked about methodologies earlier on, the methodologies that California uses are based on what's called the positive list approach. They've identified a series of activities that are generally not common, and they said, you can do them. Like, if you're doing this activity, it's not common in the market, check. You can basically, it's more of a tick box exercise where you can meet the eligibility criteria.
Can you give us an example of a tick box activity?
Agricultural digesters, right? A digester at a farm, at a pig farm. So generally speaking, the understanding was that there are no digesters. Most of the waste was handled in open lagoons, and it was creating huge amounts of methane. So if you put in a digester, you cover the lagoon up, you manage it, you capture and destroy the methane, you're in. You're automatically in. So these approaches actually have been very powerful because they help to streamline the approval process. And now with all the improvements that we have in respect of accounting with digital MRV, I think we can see how you could scale it. What CAR or the California government never did was figure out, again, what's the end game. And so at VERRA, years ago, we did an exercise where we tried to clarify what the rules ought to be for how you actually, when do you stop the crediting? And we settled on some numbers that were very preliminary. And if you think of, just take you one very simple example, if you think about market penetration for certain activities that you can actually measure on a market penetration basis, we said, well, you can go no more than 5%. And we settled on that number because we ran out of time. We were, and we really didn't have any basis for understanding how do we set these threshold penetration levels in a way that makes sense. What I think we can do now, and this is, I invite the academic community to think about this, is how do we set penetration thresholds that actually ensure or give us a greater likelihood that that sector is going to be transformed. And if you can get to that positive tipping point, right, you can credit up until that point, and then the benefit isn't just the reductions that you're paying for, but the real benefit is you get all this other stuff. And so just back to the streamlining point, there's some great research done by Everett Rogers. I'm not sure if you guys have heard Diffusion of Innovations, right? Where he kind of studied how American corn farmers adopted new corn seed. And he broke the world down into kind of early, entrepreneurs, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards, right? It's a typical bell curve and the S curve of adoption. We need to unpack and understand from an academic, practicality perspective, what are appropriate market penetration thresholds that are going to get to us. If we can identify those, then we can streamline the approval process. And we could just say, take the regenerative ag sector, say, oh, look, for farmers in this particular region, we've assessed that you need to get 17% of them to transform, to switch over. The other thing, that the reason this is important, by the way, is that research, subsequent research has validated not only the concept, but that the challenge is called the chasm. The real challenge in getting sectors to flip doesn't start at 2% or 5%, which is where the current limit is. It starts at 16%, right? So you need to get to at least the 16% where you can really actually flip an entire sector. But if we can actually get there, then you get the rest of the benefit. You streamline the approval process, and then you can get finance to flow at scale, and you get the real benefits that we're looking for.
So, Jen, I want you to weigh in, but I just want to come back to Tracey for 1 second. So this sort of, it doesn't seem like the project you described is a tick box project. tick box project, right? Like it's something very, very different than is the common practice digesters on pig farms or not. And so I'm just curious whether you see those as complementary approaches, because from a institutional perspective, as I think about participating, like, I know you can't sell your offsets, but like when I think about contributing to your project versus, you know, a VERRA verified digester project, it seems like very different things. Do you see those existing parallel to each other? Do you know, or I'm just curious sort of how you see this.
Well, I mean, I agree with David that there's a need to simplify the process. The process of developing a carbon offset project. I mean, ours was complicated because we were working very closely with indigenous peoples, but any project takes years to get, I mean, especially the PDD process, like having to work with external experts for the remote sensing to calculate the carbon. It's an extremely complex process. You know, again, I mean, part of the reason that we did it in the way that we did was because we recognize the importance of working closely with local and indigenous peoples, and also wanted to carry out some of the research behind it. I do think that it is necessary to scale what I'm talking about. And given, you know, the new sort of digital MRV tools, you know, the use of remote sensing to better measure carbon, ways in which remote sensing can also sort of track biodiversity in certain ways, and also some of the new biodiversity bioacoustic tools, and the use of AI, I think we can significantly reduce the complexity of these projects, which will allow us to scale them. I mean, so we, and you know, again, the project in Ecuador, it started out as a carbon offset project. It would fly, you know, it would like sort of pass muster in any sort of carbon market space. Like we were in conversation with the Ecuadorian government about that possibility. However, the community was really clear, given a lot of the concerns like that we've talked about, to move in the carbon contribution space. However, in a lot of ways, it's really no different in terms of the carbon calculation, in terms of managing against leakage and permanence, the integrity. Again, we also tracked biodiversity. The social benefits and the co-benefits were definitely important. So it's the same. You know, what's different is the claim that the buyer can make, and in some ways, given the challenges of the term carbon offset, a carbon contribution, particularly for forests, in the short term, might be a way forward. Until we can improve the environmental integrity issues and the calculations, and sort of really improving the social safeguards and being clear about the benefit sharing. I mean, that's probably at least a year out. And I think until we get there, as a way not to stall, particularly on natural climate solutions, carbon contributions may be a way forward.
Jen, do you want to add?
Yeah, no, and I love how you talked about the sort of transition nature, right? Like I think you're both. It sounds like we're all talking about sort of a moment in time right now when the market is kind of sorting itself out, right? Like where I think, to your point, David, if it were easier to get something approved, right? Maybe I guess so. That would mean you'd need to be sure that the thing that you were approving actually had the integrity such that a ton was a ton, right? What's happening in sort of a VCM 1.0 world was that things would get approved and then we weren't sure they were a ton was a ton, and then we had to bring in the ratings agencies to sort of quantify the extent to which a ton is or is not a ton, right? And then then you go down the rabbit hole of all the PR risk and everything. What eventually, right, when all of this transition is finished, it would look like the VCM is going to look like a regular grown-up market, right? And it'll be a commodities market. and you'll be able to buy and sell, and you'll know what you're getting, right? Maybe those different grades of commodities, maybe some of them will have a biodiversity tag, and some of them will have a water quality tag, and some of them will have a indigenous communities tag, or maybe some of them will have all three, you know, who knows? And they'll be priced appropriately, just like you have sort of different grades of coal in the coal commodities market today. Different, you know, grades of oranges, I guess. I mean, there's, you know, but I think that's kind of what we're headed to. And then at that point, the spend from, you know, sort of sitting in a company's perspective, we are gonna have the demand because the spend isn't gonna be in the marketing budget anymore, where it is now. It's not gonna be a sort of bespoke storytelling, you know, activity. It's gonna be actually in the operations budget to meet some very clear goals and very sort of intentional operational, you know, ends.
I just want to make sure we are going to leave some time for questions. I think we're doing okay, but I don't want to go too long. So I have one more question that's a little bit on a different topic, and then I'll come to my wrap-up questions before we take questions from the audience. And this is really a question about verification and markets in a very uncertain governance and enforcement world. So, you know, for all of the money that's gone into various projects, for example, in Brazil to reduce deforestation, the single biggest factor driving deforestation in Brazil over the last decade has been who is the president, right? By far more important than any financial anything. And a lot of these projects, particularly in tropical forests, where many of us sort of continue to love and live and work and all those things, like the governance is not always there in Brazil. Like you don't even know who owns some land, right? And so I'm curious, particularly in tropical forests, why we think that markets could work in the long term relative to sort of command and control. And this actually came up in a class that I was teaching where all of the economists that were interviewed were like, this is not an economic problem. We should just have, it should be illegal to deforest and there needs to be really good enforcement. And then all the sociologists said, no, we need like better economics, which was very interesting. It was like, the other field must know how to deal with this because we don't know how to deal with this. So I'd love your thoughts about how we think about it. It should be a question also, I guess, for the ratings agencies in terms of risk. But this is just something I wonder about when I think about, well, I would love to support forest projects in Brazil. But if the election goes the other way, all that money and those forests may just evaporate. So I don't know who wants to start with that, but.
Yeah, do you want to go? So I think it's a great question. I think Nat touched on this earlier when he was talking about the jurisdictional framework for forest conservation. And I think that there's something to having governments involved. And if we are very honest with ourselves, the voluntary market in particular has been allergic to government intervention. And it's been in part driven by the fact that, you know, the voluntary market being kind of private sector oriented, they want to get projects done, they don't want to have any obstacles, and in some cases there's been opportunities for graft, so it gets really messy. I think the world has changed now. The dynamics are different than what they were when the carbon markets first started, the voluntary market. We now have the Paris Agreement. Governments have commitments. We have other commitments or other targets that countries are trying to achieve, such as those under the Convention for Biological Diversity. You might have heard of the 30 by 30 conservation efforts. So I actually think that we need to be rethinking the aversion to getting governments involved. Now, not all governments are going to step up, but I would imagine that there are some governments who may be willing to actually support the long-term conservation of a particular area if there is early investment to protect it and use that to kind of build, you know, essentially that capacity and the training that you need to protect that forest long term. So I do think that there's a real opportunity to, and maybe there may be even a need to get governments involved, because in some cases, some of the challenges that we're seeing with forest conservation are that it's, you know, there's illegal mining, there's illegal logging. there's only so much that a well-meaning nonprofit or even private sector entity can do to enforce the law. But I think there needs to be a better conversation about how we link the two. But here's the other thing, so if you're thinking about pure forest conservation, I think government involvement is going to be key. It can be at a jurisdictional level. I think it can also be at a project level if it's done right. But here's the thing. There's another way of threading the needle, meaning that one of the problems that we have or the challenges we have with AFLU projects or nature-based projects is that we've created silos, again, back to the complicated nature of these projects. We've created silos. So if you want to do a red project, that's one 200-page PhD thesis. If you want to do reforestation, that's another 200-page PhD thesis. Agroforestry, guess what? Another 200-page PhD thesis. If you want to do regenerative ag, that's a separate one. That's crazy. That doesn't allow us to manage the landscape, right? And doesn't allow us to really kind of leverage the opportunities that exist, especially when many of those are going to enable the creation of economic agricultural products. And that is where I think we need to rethink how we're crediting these activities. Because to me, the solution is either government intervention or you create models that allow you to create value, economic values that can sustain these activities, and you use the carbon finance to kind of ramp up the activity, get to the level that you can, but then you don't need carbon finance anymore, answering the question of what do we do when the end game comes.
Either Jen or Tracey want to jump in?
I guess on your tier, just had two things, right? One is sort of related to your question about when the end game comes, and is that world, maybe a question, I hate to answer a question with a question, but it's sort of like if, isn't the point of what we're trying to accomplish that we will get to a net zero state? And so is that not the end game, such that we would no longer require the climate finance? Or are you saying that we will somehow need to continue investing in forest protection? I guess I'm not, so that's kind of my question about the end game. So
again, back to net zero, right? We reach net zero in 2050. All we're investing from a carbon perspective is removals, right? Because we've decarbonized the entire economy. So there's no more money for avoided emissions.
Right.
So in that case, we have to have built the systems that actually enable these forests to be protected through the economic activity that they're producing, maybe in areas that are nearby, and it's sort of a kind of an approach that's protecting the area because it's providing kind of ecosystem services to the agricultural production nearby, or you have a government commitment, or you create throughout time, say, a trust fund over time that enables the government to step up over time to protect the forest. But I think ultimately, when we reach 2050 or net zero, we have to, or just generally from a carbon crediting perspective, I think we have to contend with the fact that at some point the money ends. And if we don't plan for that, then we're going to be left holding the bag. And we need to think about what that system looks like. And I don't have all the answers, but I think we're not yet thinking about how we create that system that sustains itself, whether it's through government regulation or through this economic activity.
Yeah, no, I think I agree that's an important point.
I mean, sorry if I could just jump in. I think it's incredibly optimistic to think that we won't still need a lot of carbon removal by 2050. Net zero is so called because it's netting out, 10 gigatons plus of CO2 in 2050, right? So I think if we get to the place where it's a real problem because we've really zeroed out all of our emissions everywhere, that's a good problem to have.
Let me just be clear. We're going to need plenty of removals, right? That's what net zero is. But in a perfect world, we're not paying for avoidance reductions.
I see.
Right?
Yeah, that's
right.
And that's the point.
I see.
That avoidance, so actually forest conservation has a bit of a shelf life issue on it. Yeah. Like we need to drive as much finance to protect the forest now, because although if we don't do that, we're toast.
I understand.
But it's the avoidance part that we need to really focus on.
Yeah, so, and I just want to add that, and something that David said earlier, I mean, the carbon market has a potential to transform our economic systems if we do it correctly. If we invest in the projects, programs, and initiatives that can really sort of change the way in which we manage those forests. And I think, I mean, you mentioned Brazil, that things, obviously, deforestation rates under Bolsonaro were drastically different than it is under Lula and Lula before that. I mean, I think ultimately we want to get to a place where we don't care who is in office. I don't care if it's Bolsonaro in office, because he's going to make he's going to make the same choices, because that's the best economic value of those forests. And that's kind of what I hear, like David's been speaking to, and what I think is the potential of the carbon market. I have been someone who studied this for a very long time from a climate justice perspective, and I've come to a position to really understand that there's indigenous and local communities that are managing those forests, and they're doing it in ways that we need to pay attention to. And actually, I do agree we need a jurisdictional approach. We need sort of state actors involved, but it needs to be bottom up, because we've seen what the sort of the top-down version of conservation, what that looks like, and fortress conservation. And that's not what we're talking about. That's also not the kind of the transformative potential. That doesn't reflect the transformative potential of what a VCM 2.0, maybe even 3.0, like really looks like.
Wow, I was going to ask another question, but I feel like I kind of just stopped there. So, I guess I think, Tracey, you just answered my last question about what your ideal vision looks like. So that's really wonderful. I think, in the interest of time, let's ask the audience if there's any questions. Please come up to the microphones and ask.
Quick question. I'm understanding the certification process and the rating process. They sound a lot alike to me, and I'm not sure what the differences are, which is more exhaustive. The useful one seems to me you might need certification to get in the market, and then the rating agency assignment helps you find buyers for your credits. But it sounds like the process was pretty much the same, and so I'm looking for what the difference is in that process.
Well, I'll let David talk about.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think they've now become somewhat equal, but I think they are very different. And I think it's really important to consider the fact that the certification process is a process that's been designed through a public consultation process and kind of a regulatory-like approach. So if you look at most of the greenhouse gas crediting programs, the VCS program, the gold standard, the climate action reserve, they follow essentially a regulatory approach to creating the rules that govern that system. Now, the rules aren't going to be perfect, and they need to be changed over time and improved. That's fine. But I mean, I'd ask, maybe curious to know what Spencer had to say about this. But I think the ratings agencies are folks who believe that they have the science and the credibility to make their own determinations about projects. But I think it's a very different thing, and we need to make sure that we differentiate between the two, because I think one of them is, question to you, Spencer, is your ratings process open to the public? Is that all open? Because I'd be curious to know what that looks like.
We have all our methodologies on our website. They're all public documents. They did not go through the process that you just described to be created, but they all are publicly available. I've used an analogy a couple times recently. It's like baking a cake. The standard body writes the cookbook. The project developer is the baker. The VVBs check to see if you followed the recipe, and we're like the taste tester. Like, did the cake come out looking good, and does it taste good or not? And so they're independent processes with a slightly different purpose and different processes. And just to be clear, nobody has to submit new PDDs to us. We use all the information that comes from the registry, so we are reliant on what the registries do from an information perspective. So hope that
Is that true for all the ratings agencies, that all the information is available publicly, like all the processes and the methodologies?
It is not true for everybody. We're the only ones that make the ratings themselves public. I'm not sure about the current status of everyone else's methodologies. I wouldn't speak for them, but ours are all publicly available on our website.
Go ahead.
I have a question that's potentially about VCM 3.0. So at the moment, when you're salvaging CFCs, say in India, this is an interaction between Brown and a project developer in India. But you mentioned the Paris Agreement earlier, and both the US and India have decarbonization goals and net zero targets. So how do you think the market would be influenced if this automatically became an interaction also between India and the US, if they had to adjust their balances? And do you think that is a realistic future development?
I mean, I think we're like mainly talking about sort of the voluntary market space, carbon market space, as opposed to the kind of the NDCs, nationally determined contributions. So I don't think, I think ultimately, obviously, voluntary carbon markets are international. And so, if the ICVCM and some of these like standards that are really working on integrity are going to have an impact on the global market. So and I think like what's needed right now are some really clear examples of high quality projects with standards that back those. Because I think right now, the standards are evolving. We've been actually also working on a standard that sort of draws lessons from community-based projects. And so I think there's a lot of work that's being done right now to improve all aspects of voluntary carbon market space. Because I think ultimately we need significant, and it's been said earlier, we need significantly more climate finance to go toward natural climate solutions. I mean, if deforestation in the Amazon continues, that's like we're reaching a tipping point, and that has massive ramifications. So forests are needed, and we need more funding to go there. But the standards, the higher integrity, and the sort of carbon calculations, but also the social dimensions need to be operating at a very high level. And so I think with examples and with backing from clear standards and sort of and transparency, that can have an impact on the global market, where other countries who also are buying carbon offsets, it will ultimately influence the larger space. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ned Abelson, class of '78, when at least a few of you probably were not yet born, and this certainly was not a major topic of discussion. I'm glad things have progressed a bunch since then. One of the things that's sort of been a theme with all the panels is the status of the market and tipping points and whether or not we're there yet. And I guess that my question is more for Jen, but I'm interested in everybody's reaction in terms of whether the market has critical mass. Is Rubicon's thinking not yet, and we want to get in before that happens so we can capitalize on it, which would make sense? I'm really just curious in terms of where people think we are in terms of the market really taking off, for whatever reason.
Yeah, no, we believe the market is inevitable, like I said. It's just so obvious, right, that there are so many companies out there that have the need to reach their net zero goals, and it's also equally clear that many of them are going to have trouble internally decarbonizing to the extent that they will need to in order to meet those goals in a timely way. So where's the market right now? It's been very slow. Right, it's been really slow since early. It was beginning to pick up in 22, and then the Guardian articles hit in January 23, and the bottom dropped out. Right, it's been very, very slow. Buyers are reticent. They're holding back. They know they're going to need credits. They might have net zero targets, but they're not yet stepping in because they're afraid. Right. Furthermore, right, I could not get off of this stage without describing the chilling effect that SBTI's October 21 net zero standard had on the market, right? Because what SBTI did with that standard was they basically said, offsets were off limits for any company trying to meet its decarbonization goals, unless they were meeting only their residual emissions. And even then, they were limited to permanent removals, which do not exist in the market today. I can't say that enough, right? Those credits are right now cost between $500 and $1,000 a ton, if you can get them at all, right? Because they're just not available at scale right now. So that was SBTI's position. And permanent removals, and not only that, the last year of your net zero target, right? So you wouldn't have to, so they basically said you could invest in permanent removals in 2030 if that was your net zero target year, but you didn't need to do anything before that. So they were very allergic to offsets. I'm optimistic because there has been a little bit of a shift, right, in the last week around that position that SBTI had taken, right, due to a lot of pressure, right, and a lot of realization. I could probably talk for, an hour on the various sort of companies and their positions and sort of how this kind of happened. But that's actually good news for the market, and that only happened this week, so I don't know what the effect will be, but if SBTI allows 50% or sort of encourages or says it's okay for companies with an SBTI target to meet 50% of their Scope 3 goals, 50% of their Scope 3 sort of emissions using, credits. An analysis by Trove a few, like last year, which is a carbon market research entity in the market, they basically said that if that were to happen, then the companies that currently have SBTI goals, and the companies that have SBTI goals actually did that, right, met 50% of their Scope 3 targets using credits, the demand would triple in 2030, right? And then would go up to demand would triple from 250 million tons to 650 million, almost triple, right, to 650 million tons. And then it would reach 2 gigatons, just a few years after that. So that's sort of, the jury is out, right? We don't know what they're eventually going to say or how it's going to pan out. But that's a very, from my perspective, a very positive signal, right, from this quasi-regulatory body that holds a lot of sway and a lot of people listen to.
I would just add beyond that, I think you're absolutely right, Jen, to point out those numbers. But I just get the sense that the pendulum is swinging. And we've gone to a very kind of, bad spot where we were in the market when the Guardian article came out and the John Oliver piece and those. I think we're coming back and we're starting to see a resurgence of this market, which I do think is somewhat inevitable. But it's because there's been some really important work being done. So, you heard from Annette this morning from the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. That's really, really important. They're going to provide that confidence that gives corporates the ability to say, okay, I'm not going to get called out for this. Then you've got the work that Rachel was talking about, right? The VCMI, to be able to have a credible claim. Now, in a perfect world, we would have had these institutions 10 years ago, quite frankly. But the market wasn't big enough, and we never really thought we'd get to this point. And now we've kind of had to figure it out on the fly, but we are figuring it out. And I do think that the market's going to come back and going to be in a much stronger position going forward.
Kim?
Yeah. Hi, Kim Cobb, Director of IBIS and erstwhile offsetter. So one of my questions is about that kind of VCM 3.0 market, where we might think about the role of consumers getting into this space. We've talked a lot about kind of corporate spaces or larger organizations, but I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for my own family unit, trying to work my way through this, and it's one of the most common questions I get as a climate communicator as well. So I'd love to throw that to you and to think about how do we approach that space as people who want to move the needle. And I think to the questions you were just grappling with, there's a clear communication challenge now with this emergent market and its evolution. So what is the opportunity spaces for moving the needle on that from your perspective?
So I'll just start off by saying that, I think until we have more clarity from the ICVCM, from VCMI, until we've got sort of clearer and stronger rules around what integrity looks like in the carbon space, there's obviously the ratings. I think the rating agencies I think are make a lot of sense. They've done that due diligence for us. And as I mentioned before, I think another option is what's called the carbon contribution model. I mean, it's a lot, especially for families. I mean, an institution might be different. You've got a certain set of goals. But again, I mean, you still calculate your carbon footprint. You can still use that same number, but then you look for projects that have a climate benefit, but might have much stronger social and ecological co-benefits. And there are many projects like that out there. And so, it's just about the claim. And as a family, you don't necessarily need to make a sort of a carbon neutrality claim, although you can still calculate the amount of overall carbon and sort of the amount of money that you'd like to spend. But I think you want to take action, and I think if it's an offset, I think in the meantime, the rating agencies make a lot of sense, and then also consider these sort of other sort of more carbon contribution on projects, which is starting to get a lot more traction.
To be clear, Kim and I actually do compete on the carbon footprint and offset side of things, just personally. So I want the real deal off record, so I can win. Did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you for the great panel. I'm Francesca. Someone earlier on a panel mentioned the role of Chinese companies and how transparent they've been in reporting carbon. And I largely feel like China is out of the conversation when we talk about the VCM. Like, most of the panelists today have come from American companies. A lot of the registries are American or European based, et cetera. But China being the largest current emitter and I believe the largest issuer of voluntary carbon markets today, I just wanted to hear your all's commentary on the voluntary carbon market's role in, I guess, alleviating the geopolitical tension between the US and China that is largely competing, but potentially could help alleviate some of that. Thank you.
It's a great question, and I do think that there's an opportunity for using the trading mechanism, the relationships you build through these processes. China, in my mind, has actually been fairly aggressive on climate change, and they don't get enough credit. Certainly here, we like to bash China, but they've actually done some pretty innovative things. I haven't followed exactly where they are recently, but I think the evidence that was pointed out before is really important to consider, because if it's that suggests that those companies are taking this seriously and see resource constraints out into the future, which is something which a lot of American companies aren't doing. And I think that may come back to haunt us, quite frankly, because I think that, they may not be constrained by the kind of politics that we're dealing with right now. And I think that speaks to the ability and the need to really have an honest conversation about what this is all about and what kind of constraints we're going to have on our economy in the future if we don't do anything about it. So I think we need to be looking at, lessons and actions from other countries, because I don't know that we've figured it out here for sure.
So I think in the interest of time, do you have one quick question? Go ahead.
Yes.
Please come to the microphone.
I noticed that the ratings for carbon offsettings are very similar to debt ratings for bonds. And so I was wondering about your thoughts on the green bond market and how, I guess, the combined practices of the carbon credit market can coincide with that in helping fund investment in this industry.
So we can actually ask any of our panelists, maybe anyone want to come up, or we can ask the panelists who are here.
I'm not an expert on green bonds.
Yeah. And do any of the panelists want to weigh in on green bonds? Or Ricardo, I'm sure you do.
I don't want to, Stephen, but I will. Yeah. So, I think that there are very different processes, the green bonds and the carbon markets, right? Green bonds, I think, are interesting because they're a debt, right? They're a debt instrument that has to be paid back. So figuring out the ratings of green bonds, there are two levels. One, can the debtor pay it back, on the one hand? On the other level is it truly green? And are you getting what you said you wanted to get in green? I think that's where they potentially overlap. Some questions of, you could, if you wanted to, go down the rabbit hole of additionality with green bonds. Are they truly additional? Are they not? I don't think we should, because I think what we want to do is, like we've talked about on carbon, is encourage more activity that looks green, that is that sort of thing, and having bonds as a way to pay for it, I think is a useful question. I think what's interesting in the green bond markets is that you get the financiers, understand the debt side of this equation. They don't understand what makes it green. The sort of environmental groups say, green bonds, billions and billions of dollars, we should tap into that. And they understand the green side of things, but they don't understand that you have to pay the money back at the end of the day. And how do you pay the money back? So I think green bonds are a fascinating story, partly because in the early days, they didn't actually have a premium on them. People weren't paying more because it was a green bond. The only benefit you got by issuing a green bond is that maybe you could sell it quicker, right? Like it was oversubscribed quicker. Nowadays, we are seeing that greenium on a green bond, and that could actually radically change the game. But it's a lot more money than any of these carbon markets we're talking about. People forget debt markets are 10 times equity markets. So if you take all the value of all the stock markets of all the world, debt is 10 times that. So much bigger than equity markets.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for just an amazing day, and all of the audience for sticking with us all day, and to those online, just thank you, everybody. This was super, super great. So thank you so much.